My mother-in-law said at a family dinner that I'm too fat for my age. When I tried to stand up for myself, she said I was being oversensitive and should learn to take a joke. When I first met my mother-in-law, I genuinely thought she liked me. She smiled warmly, asked me about my job, and even complimented my cooking when my now husband, Daniel, brought me to a family barbecue. Back then, I thought her candor was refreshing. She had a way of speaking her mind that made her seem straightforward and honest, the kind of woman who could win people over with her wit and charm. But over time, that charm began to feel more like a weapon. In the early days of my relationship with Daniel, his mother, Karen, was a looming figure. Not in the sense that she was constantly around, but her opinions carried weight in their family. Daniel had grown up in a house where Karen's word was law. She'd often joke about how she always knows best, and how Daniel's father knew better than to argue. At first, I laughed along with everyone else. But as Daniel and I got more serious, I realized her humor had a sharp edge, and it often came at someone else's expense. Karen and I never had an outright conflict, not at first. She wasn't the type to openly criticize me in a way that could be easily called out. Instead, her comments were subtle, wrapped in a layer of plausible deniability. She'd call me ambitious, but the way she said it made it sound like a flaw. She'd joke that Daniel must have a thing for independent women, but followed it with a story about how she had chosen to give up her career for the family and never regretted it. It was clear she saw me as different from her, and not in a good way. But nothing prepared me for what happened at the family dinner that night. It started out like most gatherings at Karen's house. She had invited us over for a Sunday evening meal, and the whole family was there, Karen's husband, Daniel's siblings, their spouses, and even a couple of cousins who were visiting from out of town. It was the kind of event Karen lived for. She loved hosting, showing off her spotless home and her elaborate cooking, and playing the role of the matriarch who held everyone together. I was seated at the far end of the table, next to Daniel, enjoying a perfectly cooked roast chicken when Karen's voice cut through the hum of conversation. "You know," she said, her tone casual but loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's so nice that you're comfortable with yourself, dear. I mean, I never have had your confidence to carry that extra weight at your age." The table went quiet. My fork froze midway to my mouth, and I felt the eyes of the entire room shift toward me. At first, I thought I must have misheard her. Surely she couldn't have just said that. But when I glanced around, I saw the awkward smiles and the quick glances that everyone exchanged. Karen's words hung in the air, undeniable and impossible to take back. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the heat rising in my chest. "Excuse me?" I said, keeping my voice steady despite the lump forming in my throat. Karen smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to comfort. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Oh, don't be so sensitive, honey," she said with a light laugh. "I'm just joking. You know how I am." "That didn't feel like a joke," I replied, my voice a little firmer now. It felt mean. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. I could feel his hand under the table, lightly touching my leg, as if urging me to let it go. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. "Oh, come on," Karen said, her tone growing defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it. You young people are so oversensitive these days. You can't even take a joke." "It's not about being sensitive," I shot back. "It's about being respectful." The tension at the table was thick now. No one else spoke. Karen's husband cleared his throat as if to say something, but he quickly buried his face in his plate instead. The cousins looked like they wanted to disappear, and Daniel's siblings stared intently at their glasses of wine. No one came to my defense. Karen shrugged and turned her attention back to her plate, clearly done with the conversation. "Well, if you can't handle a little humor, that's not my problem," she said, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, knock over my chair, and storm out of the room. But instead, I stayed seated, staring down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. Daniel squeezed my leg again, whispering, "Let it go," but his words only made the knot in my stomach tighten. For the rest of the meal, I barely spoke. Karen's comment replayed in my mind on a loop, each repetition making me angrier. Was this who she really was? Someone who could cut me down in front of an audience and then act like I was the problem for not laughing along? And what about Daniel? Why hadn't he said anything? Was he really okay with his mother treating me this way? As the dinner dragged on, I couldn't help but notice the little smirk Karen wore, as if she'd won some unspoken battle. And maybe she had. She'd made her point, I wasn't one of them. I was the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit. But I wasn't going to let her have the last word. Not forever. That night, as we drove home, I told Daniel exactly how I felt. I told him how much Karen's words had hurt me, how humiliated I'd felt in front of his family, and how angry I was that no one had stood up for me. He listened quietly, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and when I was done, he sighed. That's just how she is, he said, his voice low. She doesn't mean it. You're reading too much into it. And in that moment, I realized something. Karen wasn't just the problem. Daniel's silence was, too. The days following that dinner were heavy with unspoken tension. I'd thought that talking to Daniel would bring us closer, that maybe he'd understand why I couldn't just brush off what happened. But instead, I felt more alone than ever. He seemed to avoid the topic entirely, as though ignoring it would make it go away. Are you still upset about what my mom said? He finally asked one evening as we sat in the living room. His tone wasn't sympathetic, it was exhausted, like he was tired of hearing about it. Yes, I am, I said bluntly. And I don't understand how you're not. She humiliated me in front of your entire family, and no one said a word. Not even you. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. She didn't mean to humiliate you. She's just, like that. She makes jokes. It's not personal. It felt personal, I shot back. You know what? It doesn't even matter if it was personal. What matters is that it hurt me. And instead of supporting me, you're defending her. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his words cut deeper than Karen's ever could. I just don't think it's worth making a big deal over. She's my mom. What do you want me to do? I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. I want you to stand up for me. I want you to tell her that it's not okay to treat me that way. I want you to show me that I matter more than keeping the peace with her. Daniel didn't say anything. The silence between us was deafening. For the next few days, I replayed the conversation in my mind, much like I had with Karen's comment. The difference was that this time, the betrayal felt deeper. Karen's words had been cruel, but Daniel's inaction made me question everything about our relationship. If he couldn't stand up for me now, what did that mean for our future? Would I always have to fight these battles alone? The breaking point came a week later when Karen called. She wanted to clear the air, or so she claimed. But her version of clearing the air was more like sweeping everything under the rug. She started by saying she was sorry if I was offended, which was not an apology at all. Then she launched into a speech about how humor was her way of bonding and how I just needed to lighten up. I'm not asking you to change who you are, I said, cutting her off mid-sentence. I'm asking you to respect me. If you can't do that, then we have a problem. Karen didn't take kindly to that. She accused me of being dramatic, of trying to drive a wedge between her and her son. Daniel would never let anyone come between us, she said pointedly. When I told Daniel about the call, he looked defeated. Why can't you two just get along, he asked, as if I hadn't been trying. As if it was my fault Karen had crossed a line. And that's when it hit me, Daniel wasn't going to change. Karen wasn't going to change. If I wanted things to be different, I would have to be the one to take a stand. But I couldn't do it alone. The question was, would Daniel stand with me? Or was I fighting a losing battle? The next few days were tense. Daniel and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house. I could tell he was wrestling with what I'd said, but I didn't know if it would lead to anything meaningful. Part of me wanted to believe he would come around, that he would see how much this mattered to me. But another part of me was bracing for the possibility that he wouldn't. Then, one evening, Daniel came home from work and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. His face was serious, his usual air of casual indifference replaced by something heavier. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "And you're right. I haven't been there for you the way I should have been. I've been so focused on keeping the peace with my mom that I didn't realize how much it was costing you, and us." I blinked, unsure if I was hearing him correctly. "So, what does that mean?" I asked cautiously. "It means I need to do better," he said. "I need to talk to her, set boundaries, make it clear that what she said wasn't okay. And I need to stop brushing things off just because they're uncomfortable. You deserve better than that." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "That means more than you know." But as much as I wanted to believe things would change, I knew this was just the beginning. Setting boundaries with Karen wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee she would respect them. And as much as Daniel's words gave me hope, they also came with a new challenge, trusting that he would follow through. Because words were just that, words. And after everything that had happened, I needed more than promises. I needed action. The days following Daniel's lukewarm promise to confront Karen were excruciating. I felt like I was living on the edge of a cliff, unsure if I was about to fall or if he'd finally pull me to safety. When he finally spoke to her, the fallout was exactly what I had predicted. "She thinks you're trying to turn me against her," Daniel muttered as we sat in the kitchen. His tone was flat, like he was reporting the weather, not relaying the latest blow in an emotional war. "And what did you say?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "I told her that's not true," he said, then paused, staring at the table. "But she's my mom. I can't just cut her out of my life." My breath caught. Cut her out? Who said anything about that? "I just want respect, basic respect." Is that really too much to ask? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples as though my frustration was a burden he had to bear. "It's not that simple," he said. The words felt like a slap. Not that simple? What was complicated about standing up for the person you claimed to love? My stomach churned with a mix of anger and despair. I couldn't believe this was the same man I'd once considered my safe place. "Let me ask you something," I said, leaning forward. "If we have kids one day, and she decides I'm not good enough as a mother, are you going to stand up for me then? Or will you tell me to let it go, like always?" Daniel's face paled, but he didn't answer. And that silence? It was louder than any argument we'd ever had. The next morning, I packed a bag. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching as I stuffed clothes into my suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm leaving," I said calmly. "You need to figure out what kind of man you want to be, and I need to figure out if I can live with the one you are now." He didn't try to stop me. That hurt more than I cared to admit. For weeks, I stayed with a friend, trying to piece myself back together. I expected guilt, regret, maybe even doubt, but instead, I felt relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for Karen's next comment or Daniel's next excuse. I could finally breathe. And then, one evening, Daniel knocked on the door. He looked different, older, maybe, but his eyes held a determination I hadn't seen in a long time. "I told her," he said, his voice steady. "I told her that if she couldn't respect you, she wouldn't be part of my life. She accused me of being ungrateful and hung up, but I don't care anymore." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I realized I'd rather lose her than lose you," he said simply. I wanted to believe him, but words were easy. Change wasn't. "You'll have to prove it," I said. "Not just to me, but to yourself." He nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "I will." Karen stayed quiet after their confrontation, but I knew her silence was temporary. She wasn't the type to accept defeat. And as much as I wanted to trust Daniel, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But here's the thing, I wasn't the same woman she had mocked at that dinner table. I had found my voice, and no one, not Karen, not Daniel, not anyone, would take it away from me again. Whatever came next, I was ready.